Thank you everyone for having me here today. Thank you, ICHL, for having me here today, and also for organizing this very unique and important and timely conference today. So in this presentation, I wanted to share some insights from a series of projects that I have undertaken in the last few years in the context of the UK, focusing on a particular specific disaster case study called the Grenfell Tower fire that happened in London in 2018. So in this presentation, I'll try to reflect a little bit on how we worked with a disaster-affected community on this education project over the past 2.5 years or so, and then what we have learned together along the way. So before diving into Grenfell specifically, let me first situate this work within the broader work that I'm doing around the topic of disaster education. So my background, as many of you probably know, is in science education research. So my starting point was really to think about teaching and learning about disasters in relation to science and STEM subjects in the broader sense. So on the screen, you can see some of the disaster-related projects that I have worked on in the last few years. That ranges from a very old disaster, 1912 Titanic disaster, which has some historic link to Southampton as a city. Southampton is the city where Titanic departed from. And my most recent case study was the 2022 Buffalo blizzard in the New York State. So as you can see, our case studies include both climate-related, weather-related, and environmental disasters, but also quite a lot of them are focused on technological system failures that are not necessarily climate or extreme weather event related. So across the case studies, I've been exploring questions such as what is the role of education in recovering from disasters and preventing future disasters, and what should be taught about disasters and how, and also from whose perspective should we be teaching about disasters, and also how teaching about disaster can help us make a better society. So much of my disaster education work has been rooted in direct engagement and collaboration with disaster-affected communities, people who lost their family members, people who survived the disasters, and people who have been supporting the affected community. So I have collaborated with 4 or 5 different disaster communities within the UK, South Korea, and the US. So another aspect is that beyond working on individual case studies, I have also tried to create spaces where different disaster communities across the border could come together to share their journeys towards justice and also to share their educational activities and to develop a shared understanding from their own individual experiences. So these exchanges, I have to say that they have been very valuable, not only for the communities, but also for me to develop my own learning as a researcher in this topic. So the theme of this conference is hazard literacy, and earlier this year, the Hazard Literacy Center here at ICHL kindly invited me to contribute an article to the inaugural issue of the Journal of Hazard Literacy. And this opportunity sort of made me reflect on my work through the lens of what I ended up calling transformative hazard literacy. So what I said in this article is I argued that disaster education initiatives, they are often driven by the logic of cost and benefit. I also said that the resilience-focused approach that are increasingly becoming very popular in the disaster community, they often tend to depoliticize disasters, and instead I advocated for an approach that encourages students to recognize and critically reflect on the social dimension and systemic inequities that shape disasters and that turns hazards into disasters. And I also argued for bringing back the social into hazard and disaster education. So what's going on? So here's the Grenfell Tower story. So this happened on the 14th of June 2017 when 72 people living in this tower lost their lives in a fire in this 24-story social housing block in West London. So in a nutshell, the fire spread rapidly because of the newly installed cladding a few years before the fire happened. And this was despite the residents' repeated warnings and concerns being expressed about the fire risks. If you'd like to actually learn more about the Grenfell story itself, there are some really excellent documentaries about Grenfell on Channel 4 and the BBC and Netflix that are based on the community perspectives and their stories. So the person pictured here is Hanan Wahabi, who is a Grenfell survivor and a bereaved family member, and who has been working for this project with us for a number of years now. So this slide highlights some of the major failures during the fire. So in a nutshell, what happened was that the flammable cladding that they put on the surface of the building acted like a furnace, basically, while the London Fire Brigade's stay-put policy made things worse, made the evacuation even more dangerous. So firefighting was severely hindered by the faulty equipment, and there were some other issues like broken lifts and dry risers out of order, and there were a lot of confusions around incorrect floor numbering in the stairwells. And also importantly, there was no senior decision maker on the scene to provide leadership during the crisis. So, and the injustice and inequalities did not end with the fire, so it continued in its aftermath. So Grenfell was, after the fire, stigmatized as a poor tower on benefits, which shaped both the media narratives and the official responses to the disaster. And the survivors had to spend months and even sometimes years in hotels as rehousing promises really fell through. So here are some key facts about Grenfell. In total, like I mentioned, 72 people lost their lives, and among them were 18 children. And the youngest was a stillborn baby, and the oldest was Sheila, who was 84. And what's also quite striking is that 41% of those who died were disabled, and 85% were from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, which is much more than the demographics that Grenfell actually represented. And if you look at the map on the right, you can see the stark inequalities in Kensington and Chelsea, which is the borough on which Grenfell stood. So this is one of the wealthiest boroughs in the entire nation, but it also contains some of the most deprived areas in the country. So Grenfell was right in the middle of this divide. On the one hand, there was extreme wealth, and on the other side, there was deep poverty, which is quite crucial to understanding the wider context of why this happened. So the inquiry that started immediately after the fire and went on for a number of years, they concluded last year with the publication of this report. And the trials of those people who are responsible have not even scheduled, and they are not going to be happening until next year, which is also making the community suffer for a longer time. And there we go. In the meantime, the Grenfell Tower, they set up this organization called Grenfell Tower Memorial Commission to gather community views on what a memorial to the Grenfell Tower fire should look like. And they are finalizing the process of selecting the design team for the memorial. And we have been collaborating closely with the Memorial Commission for our education project, because education and memorialization are very closely related to each other. So now let me move on to the project that we have been doing. So our project is called the Grenfell Curriculum Project, and we had three broader aims in the project. The first was to service the community's experiences and views and emotions on hopes related to Grenfell from particularly educational point of view. And the second was to work with the community to develop priorities and approaches and some teaching materials and so on. And recommendations for policymakers and practitioners. And the third was to explore what should be taught about Grenfell and the pedagogy of disasters such as Grenfell. So we had 6 core members in our team, and as you can see, there were 3 university-based researchers, all in education, but in different subfields of education. I come from science and STEM background, and there's Nigel, who's education values and religious education person, and there's Arjia, who was a global citizenship education person, and we also had, importantly, Hanan Wahabi, who is who has different sort of intersecting identities in relation to Grenfell. She is a survivor, and she lost her brother, his wife, and their 3 children in the fire. So she is survivor as well as a bereaved family member, and she is also a primary school teacher. And we also had 2 student assistants, you can see. So methodologically speaking, our work was grounded in community-engaged scholarship. We aim to do research with the community, not on or for the community. So we started from the belief that the Grenfell Tower community, so they actually have the knowledge that is essential and important and valuable for informing and transforming education. So our role as researchers then was to create a participatory process rather than really treating the community as mere research subjects or participants. So we are also mindful that in a lot of disaster contexts, policy is often shaped by people who are in power, powerful actors, rather than those who are most affected. So we also, in our project, wanted to shift that power dynamic a little bit by giving the voice, by foregrounding the voices of the community in expressing and foregrounding their views about education. So our project had 3 different elements, and the first was critical ethnography. So we have interviewed lots of people who have interacted with and had meetings with lots of people, bereaved families, survivors, activists, and journalists, and psychotherapists, and so on. And these conversations were quite important in shaping our work, because people who have been working as part of the community or supporting the community for the last 7-8 years, so they have really valuable views and important views that can inform how we educate about tragedies like Grenfell. And the second element was the Grenfell education meetings, which we did last summer. We had 4 separate meetings with different groups within the community. We had 1 meeting with young people, children, and bereavement survivors, and also local teachers. So we had slightly different activities. We adapted activities, and the data collection mechanisms just to make this more age appropriate and to gather their views and create some educational visions together. And the last component is still ongoing. So that started earlier this year. It's called the Co-Design Working Group of 10 survivors, bereaved family members, and also local. We have 2 people from 2 teachers from local schools in Kensington and Chelsea. So what we're doing in this working group is we're developing instructional resources, and we are eventually developing an online 3-week course for teachers to learn about Grenfell and how to teach about this sensitively and respectfully and effectively. So now I'll give a little bit more details about the second component, which is the Grenfell education meetings, and I'll talk about what we did in those meetings. So we began with a brainstorming activity in each group, centered on 3 key questions. What should students learn about Grenfell? So again, we had these meetings with people in the community. So what should students learn about Grenfell, and how should it be remembered, and what does justice mean to you in the context of Grenfell? So you had these conversations, and these were really great prompts to think about different aspects of education and teaching and learning. And for the younger groups, we introduced something called the future learning capsule. So this is like a time capsule. We asked them, so if somebody was to open this in 20 years time, what would you put in there? The story or the artifact or ideas that you want to show people in 20, 50 years time. We also discussed some ideas from the interviews that we had conducted by this point. So meeting participants were given these cards from the interview excerpt. So for example, the first one was, I would, even in lower school, I would learn about disaster happening around the world, but sometimes it's just a single fact and single event. So they have, we had these cards sort of representing the different views within the community about teaching and learning and education about Grenfell particularly. And we also discussed some existing lesson examples about Grenfell because we did these meetings 7 years after the fire happened. So we were able to find some teaching materials online which were developed by teachers across the country to teach about Grenfell at different education level as well as in different school subject contexts. So, for example, you see, and these are just 3 examples, and the first example is A-level English, 16 to 18 English, called functional skills, and the teacher asks students to distinguish between facts and opinions in relation to Grenfell. And the second one is about geography, key stage 3 lesson, where the teacher started from the socioeconomic divide in Kensington and Chelsea. And starting from the story of 2 Kensingtons, North Kensington deprived and South Kensington is extremely wealthy. And the third example is quite an interesting one because in this example, what the teacher did was to create an exam paper based on the Grenfell story using some data and economic impact and so on. So this is quite interesting to think about because the families and the community members that we worked with, understandably, they did not like the idea of having Grenfell on the exam. They did not expect to see their story in an exam paper, whereas a small number of them actually said, you know, we are heavily driven by exams. Our education system is heavily driven by exams, so we have to start accepting this being on the exam. Otherwise, students are not going to learn things about it. These are some of the anonymous feedback that we received after the meetings, and we're quite excited to see these positive feedback from our participants because we try to make these activities not just for, you know, just a data collection exercise, but a collective effort to learn from each other and create educational knowledge with the community. So as you can imagine, positionality and ethics were huge. They're very central to our work when you think about these real people that you interact with and people who have extreme level of trauma and everything. So there were questions of representation, whose voices were included. So I mean, the broadest sense of Grenfell community includes about 700 individuals. So that's quite a lot of people, and claiming to represent the whole community is a very difficult thing. And also there were concerns about exploitation. Disaster communities are usually approached by a lot of journalists, a lot of researchers in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. So they were flooded with journalists and researchers a couple of years following the disaster, and then they all disappear because their grants ended or for other reasons they have moved on to other topics. And we were quite conscious of that, and we were trying to make sure that this is a long-term effort rather than a one-off short-term event. And also there's this issue of re-traumatization. So for example, showing the traumatic picture of the disaster, for example, the picture of the tower on fire. So that is very traumatic experience to most of the family members still. So we were quite conscious of not triggering any trauma and re-traumatizing people, especially when we were working with young people in the community. So now I'll just move on to some of our findings. I'm running out of time. So one theme that really emerged from the whole of our findings was the idea of temporality, the importance of time and thinking about all of these things, and especially given that Grenfell is quite recent, it was only 8 years ago. So one of these was the slowness of Grenfell. Some people remember that as just one night accident. It actually was not. It was the result of injustices and misrule that had built up for ages and decades. So, and also for the families, the disaster is still ongoing. A lot of people are thinking that also that ended 8 years ago, but for the families that is still ongoing because they are still suffering. We're not seeing justice. Right. So another aspect related to temporality was the 8-year gap. Like I mentioned, for some people, Grenfell felt like a historical disaster in the past. For others, it's a current or even ongoing one, like I just mentioned. So there's a fear of forgetting, and it's still quite recent, but not long. It is long enough back to be forgotten for people who are not directly involved in this. And also, people are feeling different ways about how this should be memorialized. And in this second quote, this interview was done last year, and graphic imagery, I'll come back to this idea. But in the community meeting, there was a survey about, do you agree, how do you feel about using imagery in teaching about and communicating about the Grenfell disaster? And more people are saying that we should probably start using those things because that is a powerful mechanism for people to see the impact of it. And so on that issue of graphic pedagogy, so here's what we call graphic pedagogy of disasters, about the use of images and graphics in teaching about Grenfell. So you may notice that part of these slides and images are blurred or erased. The reason is obviously because like I mentioned, many families are still traumatized. We didn't want to see the picture of the tower on fire when we were working with the community members. So the first quote is from a bereaved family member who has been teaching to her students about Grenfell, and she said, so this year I have been teaching about Grenfell to my students for years, but this year I started thinking that I should probably start using these images because young children are forgetting about it. They're probably too young to remember what happened 8 years ago, but also we need a powerful reminder. So what you see here is that she's kind of talking about the before and after, before and now thing. So in the past, a few years ago, I was thinking that we should probably not do that because that's not respectful. But now I think that it's probably an effective means to highlight the injustice and the importance of this. And also another thing that you see here is she's thinking from the I and they perspective, they being young students who are not familiar with the disaster per se. We started developing, based on our work of 2.5 years with the community, we are starting to develop some frameworks, educational frameworks to teach about Grenfell specifically, but more broadly disasters and tragedies. So the first one that we have recently completed developing was a community-driven framework for disaster justice curriculum, which is about basically what to teach about disasters like this. So at the center, you see two different themes, the human story and the community context. And the second part is systemic failures and the fight for justice. So these are the foundation of disaster education, where we don't see those two things as isolated events, but as part of the wider struggles. And you see the the 6 elements around that about what learners should know, 6 aspects of that. And the outer ring, as you can see, are more about what learners should be able to do. For example, there's professional ethics and critical media literacy and community action, active listening, and empathy, and so on. And here's our tentative answer to the how question. How should we be teaching about disasters and tragedies? And this is what we call the relational temporal model for disaster pedagogy. And from our work with the community, we identified that the central tension there is to navigate between dealing with trauma and ensuring authenticity. So this is because if you try to minimize trauma and not really personalize disasters and not using any personal narratives or images and so on, there's the risk of making it very abstract and losing authenticity. So this balance is influenced by the top 3 mediating factors. You need to think about the learner context, age, and vulnerability. So younger children, there's higher risk of trauma, whereas teaching about Grenfell to 18-year-olds would need to be different. And also there's this sort of relational element. So what is your relationship? What is your personal relationship? So is there any chance that any of the learners have personal relationship connection to the disaster? And also, how far are we from the disaster geographically and temporally? So these factors are supposed to guide pedagogical responses. So protective framing, the use of metaphor and storytelling, And authenticity and connection can involve empathy, site visits, and so on. And ethical framing involves the careful choices about imagery, language, and whose story gets told. And all of these needs to be informed by the considerations that you see on the top of the page. So, one of the main lessons that we are learning is that while preventing future disasters is important, education must also help us learn from past and ongoing disasters and also remember them. So I think one aspect of my presentation, as opposed to other approaches, is it's education after a disaster, as opposed to education before disaster. So, and we also have to ask whose knowledge about disaster and hazard really counts. And our answer has been that we should foreground and we should center community knowledge who are most affected and who are most impacted by the disasters. And finally, we found that relationality and temporality should be the core elements in thinking about disaster pedagogy. So these are some of the publications that I had over the last 5 years or so on the topic of disaster and science education. And I'll just end this presentation by showing the names of the people who are lost in the disaster and whose names should be remembered through education. So that's the 72 names. And thank you.